And so with us today is our own Zina Manji, who heads up compliance with Haleon on the digital health side and has a lot to offer. And when it comes to understanding just how this works and just what some of the major issues are from a regulatory standpoint around these emerging regulatory issues and around these emerging wearable issues. And so Zina, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you, Stan. Happy to be here.
Of course,
really great discussion.
not at all. I appreciate your time. We know how busy you are and how much you've got on your plate. So thanks for coming in and joining us for a few minutes here today with our audience from around the world. Just an amazing group online, hundreds of people joining in and taking time out of their day as well. But if you could just start with an introduction, just 1 minute about yourself and what you do and your expertise.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a regulatory affairs professional. I've just completed 23 years in regulatory affairs this month, actually. And I come with a pharmacy background. So I have a PharmD and a master's in clinical pharmacy. And a few years ago, pre-pandemic, we're looking at emerging science technologies. And I really started to understand the potential for convergence of technologies and a different way of engaging for treatment, for looking at what is the potential of technology in terms of looking at real-time data, understanding how the patient is on an everyday basis experiencing disease, experiencing treatment, but also prevention and engaging earlier. It became pretty clear about the potential of intercepting early before disease flare. And with all this potential of research a few years ago, around about 2017, 2018, I was entering this space. I got the bug to say, okay, this is where I want to focus my career going forward in this space. And when you look at regulations, it's evolving, right? And the pace of innovation is accelerating. So as a regulatory affairs professional, you need to understand how are you going to adapt in that world. And so I was really happy to join the Columbia Business School Executive Ed Digital Health Series program, which really gave me a lot more insight into not just how do you manage regulatory approvals, but also how do you think, how do you ask the right questions, how do you analyze, how do you understand the business? Because from a regulatory affairs perspective, you have to create the story. And if you understand the business case, you can advise better and be a real business partner, but also translate that to the regulators.
That's great. And a terrific way to look at it too. And certainly, you are very, very familiar with manufacturers and everything that they're doing, coming over from the GSK side now with Haleon, the consumer-facing spinoff of GSK. You're seeing a lot of digital and a lot of digital adoption within consumer, obviously wearable being a big one there. What are some of the trends you're seeing right now today that, again, nothing proprietary, but just in general across the wearable ecosystem on the consumer side?
Well, I think a major thing consumers are looking for is simplicity, right? I think if the engagement is too much friction, it becomes hard to adapt and use the tool on a regular basis, or even to understand, is this even working for me? Am I getting anything out of this, right? So I think the trends are going more towards how are you providing value and how is the user understanding that value? So I think getting into more precision is more of the trend versus generalities, but getting into more precision so that you really understand on an individual basis, how are you keeping in a health state, or what is your status of your condition, whatever that may be. So I think that's a evolving area that will get more precise and build more value so you can be more specific about the value.
That's absolutely true. And, again, for those of you who are not fully aware, Zina is also a Columbia Business School alumna. She finished the digital health program and the certificate in business excellence at Columbia Business School executive education program. And she has a tremendous wealth of knowledge coming from there. And we have also joining us to add her 2 cents on the future of wearables and where they are going, Alison Darcy from WoeBot. Hi, Alison, how are you?
Hi, how are you? Very well, thank you.
No, I really appreciate your time. I know you're busy as well, and we're just really excited to have this conversation because we've been talking a lot about the digital health reset over the last year and really coming out of the pandemic. And so we'd love to hear your take on this. So tell us a little bit about cognitive therapy and what WoeBot's doing on a mobile platform around cognitive therapy.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. It's my pleasure to talk to people about what we do. So WoeBot is a digital therapeutics platform, and we build programs based on cognitive behavioral therapy, but delivered by what we call a relational agent. That is a conversational agent that does a little bit more than your sort of, banking chatbot. But it is a conversational interface called WoeBot, who is a fictional yellow character. Yeah, we have programs right now for adult general sort of mental health and emotional support. So based on depression and anxiety, for which obviously cognitive behavioral therapy is very well evidenced. We also have a program for postpartum depression, which is currently under pivotal trial for FDA clearance, and then also a program for adolescents as well.
It's amazing. And so talk a little bit about the value creation of this technology. Obviously, there's a lot happening in certainly in neurotech and brain tech and cognitive tech. Tell us a little bit about what makes WoeBot different from everyone else out there.
That's a great question. I think what WoeBot does really well is, I guess, sort of really coming to the promise of mobile health, right? Which is the whole promise of mobile health was that you had a device by your side the whole time. And of course, mostly we've leaned into that from a measurement perspective. But I think what was missing was something that could actually enable somebody to reach out and be able to use very good evidence-based tools in a moment of need as they arise. So the interesting thing in mental health is we have these wonderful models that we know are effective, like cognitive behavioral therapy. But unfortunately, if your therapist is not sort of with you at 2 a.m. as you're having a panic attack, or in the morning when you're struggling to get out of bed, then actually we're leaving clinical value on the table. So I think one of the things that WoeBot does really well, and we did set out to solve this problem of engagement. And because, of course, in mental health, the experience of struggling with your mental health, particularly of depression, is one of disengagement, right? You're disengaged from your life, from yourself, from your loved ones often. And so the ability to reach out and engage somebody in a moment of need, those moments wherein they can actually derive so much clinical value if they can use one of these tools, is tremendously potent. And I think that's really what makes WoeBot different, and the task that we did well.
It's amazing. I know Zina's really excited about this too. Zina, please shoot. I know you got a ton of questions. Go ahead.
Hi, Zina.
Yeah, no worries. Hi, Alison. Good to see you again. Yeah, I think this is a really interesting platform as I was learning more about it. And so some may ask, is this a replacement for the human therapist, right? And how do you measure against, or are you measuring against standard of care? And so it sounds like to me that it's a very different care model.
That's interesting. Yeah, it's a great question because one we get all of the time. So I think, when on the face of it, because the interface is conversational, it sort of feels like a little bit dystopian particularly at the start, and people thought, and all the headlines were, is this going to replace therapists' jobs? And of course, there is no replacement for human connection, right? That's absolutely not the point. The difference is, I think, whenever we have new technology come into the forum, is to understand the unique advantages and the unique disadvantages. And the limitations, right? So WoeBot is, again, great at being there at 2 a.m., but it's never going to be a deeply nuanced and human connected conversation. And of course, our users, I think, readily understand that. But there is something very interesting about the engagement model. I was actually just going back to the original manual that Aaron Beck wrote in 1979 on cognitive behavioral therapy, and in it he actually suggests that therapists do house visits with their clients to help them, to be there by their side when those moments that trigger their sort of negative self-views arise, and so they can help them, guide them through it. And of course, there's no therapist that has the time to do house visits, right? That's just like that's all but gone from contemporary therapy. But this is the role that a WoeBot can have. And so when you talk about outcomes, it's a really good question. I think we look at more side by side again, where are the advantages, where are the limitations, but we do believe strongly that any kind of app that claims to have any kind of emotional support functionality needs to have some research that sort of supports that. And so we do have a full program of research. We've conducted, I think it's 11 randomized controlled trials now, and are just have an ongoing program of research for two reasons. One, again, because we believe in it, and one must kind of take the time and effort to show the outcomes. But secondly, because we really believe in it as a way of developing the product, because we think that the field of digital therapeutics and mobile health in general is actually in its infancy, and we have a lot to learn. And so actually we do our best learning in clinical settings side by side with the clinicians, and we really believe in sort of elevating the role of the clinician. We think, during the pandemic, we kind of like the explosion of telemedicine and telehealth, like it was important, and it was obviously safe for many years, but it also arguably just sort of redistributed the very rare resources that we already have, and it didn't really get at the fundamental problem. And so we want to know, what pieces can we take off the table or the desk of the clinician so that we can really elevate their role, and when a patient is with a therapist, they're really with the therapist and as engaged as they possibly can.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And as we see, post-pandemic, during the pandemic, I mean, mental health has gotten a lot of focus. And as we look at, well, what is the quality of life and living well?
Yeah. That's right.
Your mental status is just so critical in all areas. That it impacts your physical health as well. So I'm wondering, in terms of how you describe the use of WoeBot, it also seems like the immediacy of interaction, the proximity of access, also seems to be important, or can be for certain patients or consumers are not diagnosed with, right? It could be you just in a very early stage, or determining do they have something going on and they just need some engagement. So in terms of that proximity, it seems like it would be important to see how is that translating into a modality. So what you describe, I think, is it's not replacing the clinician, but it's another modality that can be added to the overall therapeutic outcome or therapeutic tools that a therapist could use.
That's right. And actually that we have a lot of success in that model. And we hear things back from clinicians who refer WoeBot to their patients. Things like, my patient comes back more ready for therapy, more educated, and it's sort of like amplifying their voice in between sessions. Because of course, the irony of the clinic, and that's sort of what I call the therapeutic architecture, is that you're actually, you have to go somewhere, right? Obviously there's like the convenience piece, but it can sometimes, some of that architecture can actually undermine somebody's ability to engage. And you're typically kind of, you're getting yourself together for your therapy appointment. And then I certainly had this experience when I was treating younger people. I knew as soon as they walked out of my office, it's kind of like in one ear, out the other. Like, one of the things we know is therapy doesn't happen in a vacuum. And I think our system is quite fragmented right now. And by definition, we tend to see people when things are a little bit more severe. But one of the intentions behind WoeBot was like, could we bring it back to the sort of human experience, and therefore could like we engage people a little earlier in some of these great tools from CBT, that when you learn about CBT, I think as a clinician you just think, wow, we should be teaching this stuff in schools. This is just very good life advice. How can you stop yourself and challenge your thinking and see if there's any distortions therein? And so we in our free version of WoeBot that's available in the app stores, that is really very kind of a wellness focused kind of solution that makes us completely agnostic to diagnosis and actually doesn't use a lot of particularly, so it doesn't use any clinical language really. Therein WoeBot really shares that distorted thinking is just kind of part of the human experience, because we really believe mental health will be viewed the way that exercise was viewed 20 years ago. I think we're getting to the point where we realize, and the pandemic really helped this along, of course, that mental health is always with you and everybody has it, and you sort of have to look after it. So if we can accomplish that in a small way in tiny conversations, I think that's a good thing. The important thing is, of course, we don't overstep, and so there's a lot of barriers in place, I guess, where in WoeBot sort of will call out like, okay, this is about the limitation of what I can help with.
And it sounds like I believe there's some studies or reporting that I came across and that you mentioned that consumers or users are actually can be more open with
that's right
with this tool, even more so. Maybe it differs by users. I'd like to understand that from you, but it seems like don't have that barrier, but can express more authentically.
That's right. Before we created WoeBot, there was an interesting study that was conducted in Southern California where they randomized people to two conditions. Both conditions got this virtual therapist called Ellie. It was a very sophisticated technology, but one of the groups was told that there's a human behind what Ellie says. And the group that actually was told the truth, which is this is just an AI, were actually more willing to disclose to the virtual therapist. So that was really interesting. And that was a really nicely designed, robust study. But we do find, we did an interesting study a few years ago wherein we delivered something called the Working Alliance Inventory, which is really sort of a measure that's used in traditional treatment outcomes research to look at things like therapeutic bond. And we found that in just 3 to 5 days, WoeBot created a bond with users that was non-inferior to that created by human therapists for in comparison studies against which we compared the scores. And the thing that's interesting there is we did the study not to show, hey, we're as good as a human or we're comparable, but it was to say, it was in answer to, I think, one of the big assumptions that we've had for so long, which is digital solutions will always be limited because you don't have this human connection. Whereas when you look at the things that the human connection is also delivering, it's things like, I feel heard, I don't feel judged, I trust this, and I can reach out anytime. This person is there for me whenever I need help. And of course, those are things that digital can actually achieve. And so and that's what we demonstrate. Again, it's not a human connection and it never will be, and people don't mistake it for such, but there are elements there that we think can enhance the findings and the data that you can get from a purely digital solution. And that's going to be really important for scaling our overall approach to sort of lowering the burden of suffering in the population.
So it sounds like the potential here is actually getting more information from the user in terms of what they're experiencing in a moment, and how that engagement is helping them feel. And you can track that with the engagement with this tool, or it can be tracked. Even the user, I'm assuming, can also see how they're doing.
That's
you
right.
You mentioned about the different, the engagement, and that you can measure that engagement. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because there's how do you know that you have success? And since,
great question.
Since mental health can be so complex, and environments also impact people's mental state, and the environment can be
Yeah.
so diverse and very different.
That's right.
So how do you measure? How do you know you're measuring for success? And the other aspect is that engagement, that level of engagement, which I thought was really interesting when we talked about earlier about a therapeutic dose.
Yes, that's really I guess it's the promise of a platform like ours, is that we have scale, and so we can look at like different subpopulations and how they are responding in different ways, and for whom what works and under what circumstances. And that is really exciting from a research point of view. And I think how do we know we're having impact is a brilliant question. So we do the trials, and we do we have those, obviously outcomes, and we do PROs. But in the unit, the basic unit of a single engagement, we think the ground truth is, do you feel better? Like, does the person feel better after doing what is often quite difficult work, right? So we're not here to just kind of give people compliments and things. We're actually bringing them through a therapeutic technique where they are confronting their negative thoughts or confronting their role in an interpersonal dispute, which can be quite painful. And so how do you feel now? Better, same, or worse? That becomes one of the key pieces of learning that we deliver. So we ask that question after every tool, any therapeutic technique. And then, but what we're finding is that we did a study where we modeled engagement clusters, and we did find individual differences. So, which I think is it's very interesting. So we found, for example, that some people use WoeBot more efficiently, so they use it very frequently, and which we used to call sort of like an antibiotic kind of usage, sort of every day for about 2 weeks. And they have very steep symptom reductions, even if they start in a more symptomatic range, versus other people who are more sort of, as painkiller, if you like, sort of come in whenever as needed, and kind of pop out, but might re-engage 6 months later, 8 months later. And it's fascinating. And so we used to think about modeling something that we called sort of maybe it's meaningful engagement, like what constitutes that really potent kind of encounter. But that's right, we've moved now to a concept of potency, like what is the right encounter for the right person at the right time. And that's fascinating. And I hope that we're able to continue to kind of contribute to the field about those things.
I
This
think
is
this
great.
is
Yeah, thank you both for joining today. We're out of time. I apologize, but we are running long.
Thank you.
Wonderful to see you, Alison. Thank you, Zina, for a wonderful panel.
Thank you so much.
Cheers.
Thank you.